Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having joined us today. We have just finished our Matera ministerial meeting, and we ended with a final statement which summarizes, say, the contents of our meeting. We reiterated a number of well-known concepts. Firstly, the fact that the two topics we've chosen, i.e. violence against women and women's empowerment, are closely intertwined, and fighting violence requires the use of targeted instruments, but can also be achieved with economic empowerment, employment opportunities for women, and the freedom to choose motherhood without suffering, let's say, negative consequences from a professional point of view. We also reiterated the existence of the link between women's freedom and empowerment. There can be no empowerment without freedom for women. And freedom, obviously, is considered as a very broad concept, and we condemned all forms of violence, not only those that we are familiar with, economic, psychological, intimate partner violence, but also the violence that we unfortunately see in conflict, rape committed during conflict, including conflicts such as the one in Ukraine. And as we know, there were instances of rape, as there were on the 7th of October during the attack perpetrated by Hamas against Israel. We also included in our ministerial statement something new that can be considered as the most innovative element, i.e. equality in sport. Firstly, we have to ensure that all have equal access to sport, and we know that there still is a difference, a significant difference between men and women, boys and girls. For instance, in sports competitions, there is a significant difference between the prizes for female events and those for male events. There is also a considerable difference in terms of access to sport, but there's also a potential lack of justice with respect to fairness in sport. And we've seen this in the last few months. There has been a debate during the Olympic Games, before and after the Games, on these matters. And we actually dealt with this, not least because tomorrow the UN rapporteur, violence against women, will in fact focus on equity in sports, equality in sports, and this is something that involves participation in sports events on the part of trans athletes, or let's say persons with not clearly defined, let's say, sexual identity. And we have included a paragraph on this, which I would like to read because it is the most innovative part, and I'll read it in Italian. We want to ensure equal opportunity between men and women, or for girls and women in sports in all areas, in terms of access, training, coaching, competition, remuneration, and we also want to recognize the importance of sport for all women and girls based on transparent, scientifically relevant and evidence-based shared standards. And these are to be established by independent sports authorities in order to avoid all forms of discrimination and promote gender equality. And I think that this is the first time that a forum such as this deals with equal opportunities in the area of sport in its statement. Therefore, the ministers have included this and other topics, including employment, health, care work. And this is done building on the statements of the previous G7, because obviously the G7 is committed to continuity, and obviously next year we will be handing over to the Canadian presidency. The statement, I believe, is at your disposal. It is available. And at this point, I would like to ask you whether you have any questions. And before we open the floor, please introduce yourselves, stand, and try and be brief in your question so that everybody can have a chance to ask their questions. We will take 3 questions at a time before we hand over to the Minister for her answers. Minister, is there any initiative likely to have, let's say, a positive short-term impact on women and their conditions? Antonella Cervo from the Daily Quotidiano del Sud. You mentioned different forms of violence. These are elements that were highlighted yesterday during an international meeting. Is there a common approach in order to fight all these forms of violence effectively? Is there a third question? Front row.
Onofre Bruno, agenzia di stampa ADN Kronos. Nella dichiarazione, nello statement, avete inserito una condanna per gli stupri di guerra e per quello avvenuto il 7 ottobre, ci avviciniamo anche al triste anniversario, di Hamas in Israele. Ci sono altri conflitti che avete tenuto in considerazione in questo statement?
Bene, parto da quest'ultima domanda. Naturalmente noi abbiamo citato i conflitti in corso, ma era semplicemente, sono stati gli esempi più eclatanti, anche perché, questa è una mia valutazione, devo dire, il caso del 7 ottobre ha prodotto una escalation di violenza, una qualità di violenza diversa da quella normale, diciamo tra virgolette, perché normale certamente la violenza nei confronti delle donne non è mai, ma diciamo da quella più abituale che avviene purtroppo più o meno in quasi tutti i conflitti, in quasi tutte le situazioni di guerra. L'attacco di Hamas ha avuto delle caratteristiche diverse, diciamo così, programmate, tant'è vero che alcune associazioni femministe lo hanno invece considerato come il primo caso di femminicidio di massa. Quindi noi abbiamo focalizzato su questi 2 conflitti che ci riguardano e che sono veramente su tutte le pagine dei giornali tutti i giorni, purtroppo, con sempre nuove gravi situazioni di sofferenza della popolazione civile, quindi l'Ucraina e Israele, il conflitto israelo-palestinese, ma in particolare la questione del 7 ottobre. Però naturalmente abbiamo allargato il discorso a tutte le situazioni di conflitto, proprio sottolineando il fatto che in tutte le situazioni di conflitto, questa è proprio la dizione anche che abbiamo utilizzato, va sempre condannata la violenza e dobbiamo avere gli strumenti e forse rafforzare anche gli strumenti internazionali per le situazioni di violenza contro le donne e per poter...
We have to condemn all the perpetrators as a consequence. With respect to what should be done to combat violence, well, we reiterated that there are a number of international tools that are available, the 4 Ps: prevention, prosecution, protection of victims. And we do have a number of other instruments, the European Directive, which was recently adopted, and we're also focusing more on economic violence. And possibly this is something new. Obviously, we've talked about secondary victims and the violence that is committed against children and that obviously impacts their mothers. Economic violence, on the other hand, is often overlooked, whereas it is linked very clearly to women's possibilities in terms of, say, leaving violent relationships. Economic independence is obviously important for a woman to be able to leave, let's say, a violent context and look towards new opportunities. We also stressed another form of violence that is often overlooked, the violence that is suffered by the victims of trafficking, especially the women and children who are victims of sexual exploitation. And it's a vicious circle because we know that often it's very hard to break out of these violent contexts when women become victims of trafficking in human beings. These are the many forms of violence against women. What have we done? Well, obviously, each government can do something concrete. Our government in particular has already started implementing a number of very concrete measures. Female employment in Italy has reached an unprecedented level. All G7 countries have actually focused on this, highlighting the best practices that each government has introduced. There are various approaches, ranging from quota systems introduced in a number of countries to, let's say, forms of bonuses or benefits, and also others have stressed the need to promote greater equality when it comes to care work. We also have looked at more traditional instruments to promote employment for women. As G7, we have stressed the importance of cooperation at a global level, and particularly among G7 countries. We have to make sure that best practices are followed, and we have to focus on, let's say, what G7 countries can do. But of course, there can be no concrete measure as such. Let's see if there are any more questions over here. Liana Gallardi from Sky. Let's look at the priorities that we have to work on in order to, let's say, reach some results in the short term. Marcello Porchio from the paper L'Edicolo del Sud. You mentioned empowerment when addressing the issue of violence against women. When it comes to empowerment, which strategies can be implemented. Sharing best practices, of course, is something that we feel is certainly a viable approach. This promotes greater awareness on the part of women, and that way empowerment can really and truly be delivered. Michele Capolupo from Sassi Live. Could you use 3 words to summarize the ministerial meeting in Matera, also with reference to the city? I'd like to start with this last question because, of course, it's the one I really am pleased about. All G7 representatives expressed their appreciation for the venue and for the wonderful food that they enjoyed, the typical local food, and we have organized a visit to the world-famous Sassi of Matera. And we also stressed that the name Matera, in all likelihood, comes from the Latin word mater, mother, and this is one of the possible origins of the name of this city. We've also continued our exchange. We were very lucky also in terms of the weather. The forecast was rain, so we were very lucky indeed. We were able to have a very pleasant atmosphere. With regard to our priorities, well, when it comes to empowerment, we all agree that we have to achieve a good work-life balance. Different countries have pursued different approaches, but this is a priority because women must be free to become mothers if they so wish to, without sacrificing their career, without in any way forgetting their dreams and foregoing any, let's say, path to achieve their fulfillment. We focus specifically on STEM subjects and on how girls should also be encouraged to study science and technology subjects. As we know, these are the subjects that ultimately can guarantee better, say, employment conditions, better remuneration, and yet we all know that there is a common problem in Italy, in Japan, in Canada, in terms of a gap between, let's say, the number of boys in STEM subjects and the number of girls who choose STEM education. And we stress that we need to act very early on, not when, let's say, guidance is provided on possible university courses. This is something that has to start in primary school because girls are not, let's say, encouraged to pursue, let's say, their studies in science, technology, economic and maths. And then we also talked about AI, on how AI can be used in order to, say, achieve greater, say, opportunities and developments without, however, ignoring the risks. And there has to be a standard approach to regulating AI in Europe and among G7 countries too, because it is only through, let's say, a consistent approach that we can hopefully reduce these risks.
We have 3 questions. Is there anyone wishing to ask questions? Well, we thank Minister Mrs. Roccella, and I do hope that these priorities are also priorities for information, because it is essential for information to provide its support to fill in this difference that we have tried to fill in also with this meeting here in Matera. Thank you.